As news from the conflict in Ukraine continue to dominate the headlines, many are worried about what could come next. But in order to know where we may be headed, we first should look back to see how this all began, with the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of a man named Vladimir Putin. I'm Ryan Osborne, and this is World in Context. I'm Ryan Osborne, and welcome to World in Context. Today we'll be concluding our series on the war in Ukraine and the history that led us to this moment. On the last episode, we took a look at the wars Russia has fought since the end of the Cold War and attempted to determine some pattern as to Russia's use of military power. And today we're finally going to be taking a look into the events of the 2022 Russo-Ukraine War itself, keeping everything we've discussed in the back of our minds, and after we run through some of the events leading up to the invasion itself, and the war up to this point, I'll throw a few possibilities out as to where we might be headed next. Now, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that the war in Ukraine is one of the most well-documented, if not the most well-documented wars in history, thanks in large part due to the proliferation of smartphones, drones, and access to the internet. And as such, you'll have to forgive me if I don't fit every instant of the war in here. Otherwise, we'd be here for many, many hours. But with that out of the way, let's get started. First, with the build-up to the war itself. The first domino to all of this was when the government in Ukraine placed a high-profile Ukrainian businessman and politician and a personal friend of Vladimir Putin named Viktor Medvedchuk onto their sanctions list for funneling money from his refinery into anti-Ukrainian separatist groups along the Russian-Ukrainian border. 2 days after Medvedchuk was sanctioned, Russia announced the deployment of 3,000 paratroopers to the Russian-Ukrainian border for large-scale exercises. Fast forward to March, and you see the beginning of NATO's Defender 2021 exercise, a move that was quickly criticized by Russia, who would announce their own exercise along the Ukrainian border, slowly amassing up to a total of 40,000 men. 8 days later, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced Ukraine's intent to one day retake Crimea by any means necessary. This statement came in the midst of Russian and Russian-backed separatists periodically firing mortars over the border into Ukrainian-held positions. Medvedchuk was named a suspect for high treason, and 3 days later, Russia began to liquidate the Russian-owned company Novoye Protkoy, which was allegedly used by Medvedchuk to funnel money into Crimea. As the months dragged on, Russia announced an end to their military training exercise, but despite this, the troops remained along the border and showed no signs of going anywhere. August 30th, 2021. After the collapse of the Afghan government, the United States leaves Afghanistan in a publicly humiliating and disorganized manner. During the frantic withdrawal, the United States left hundreds of millions of dollars of high-end equipment behind, left many locals who had helped them for years to the hands of the Taliban, abandoned U.S. citizens relying on other nations to get them out, and lost 13 Marines to a suicide blast that also left hundreds of civilians dead. But while the headlines were focused on the damaged image of the United States abroad, Russia continued to quietly move up its plans. On September 9th, directly following the United States' withdrawal from Afghanistan, Russia and Belarus announced a joint military training exercise, slowly continuing to build the number of troops along the border. By early November, intelligence officials within the United States began sending warnings out to allies in Europe of a potential impending Russian invasion. Ukrainian intelligence had assessed that the number of Russian troops along the border had now ballooned to over 90,000. On December 20th, disturbingly, Russia passes new legislation on the creation of mass graves during times of conflict. The document outlines how to create mass graves without contaminating local water supplies, and how to handle the creation of such sites of mass death disposal. New rules regarding the mass graves were set to take effect on February 1st. On January 1st, Russia quietly begins removing staff from the Kyiv embassy as tensions continue to rise. And several days later, on January 14th, a Russian submarine cuts an underwater comms cable to the Norway radar installation. Fast forward a couple of days, and a Russian fleet departs through the Baltic Straits, packed with troops headed for the Black Sea. During the same time frame, Sweden observes significant aerial drone activity near their nuclear power plants. With everything going on, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania announced that they will be providing weapons to Ukraine should a war break out, while Germany vocally refuses to send any aid and criticizes efforts to do so. On January 21st, Russia deploys S-400 anti-air battalions into southern Belarus to deter a NATO response. The same day, the Communist Party of Russia introduced legislation to the State Duma requesting that President Putin recognize the Ukrainian breakaway regions of Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic as independent nation-states. 2 days later, Russia demanded NATO return to its pre-1997 borders. That same day, Russia held a massive military-naval exercise in Norway's economic exclusion zone. The United States had evacuated its embassy in Kyiv, and Germany barred Estonia from selling its artillery pieces to Ukraine, claiming that the weapons in question had been in East Germany at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union and therefore were still owned by Germany. By the end of the month, Russia had begun blood drives all across the country and began shipping blood to the Russian-Ukrainian border. Blood drives many believed to be the smoking gun of an imminent invasion incoming, as unlike other supplies, blood has a very limited shelf life and in frontline conditions, and as such, it is typically not used as part of simple military exercises. On February 4th, President Putin traveled to China where he met with Chinese President Xi on the eve of the Winter Olympics. There, he vowed deeper ties with China and decried the West and NATO over expansionism. A day later, 2 anonymous U.S. officials reported that Russia had amassed 83 battalions along Ukraine's borders and estimated that over 70% of Russia's fighting capabilities had deployed to the region. On February 17th, Russian and Russian-led militia artillery strikes intensified on Ukrainian positions in the Donbas region. This Ukraine believed to be an attempt to provoke the Ukrainian military into taking some action that Russia could use as justification for invasion. During the more than 60 artillery attacks, a kindergarten in Ukraine was struck, injuring 3 civilians. The following days, the governments of the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, breakaway regions of Ukraine, ordered emergency evacuation of their capital cities. Though, interestingly, the video announcements seem to have been filmed 2 days prior to being released to the public, and shortly after the announcements were made, Russian media reported on a car bombing targeting the separatist headquarters at Donetsk. Several days later, on the 21st of February, FSB reported that one of their border patrol posts had been destroyed and that they had killed a group of 5 saboteurs and destroyed 2 infantry fighting vehicles that had crossed into Russia. Ukraine denied any involvement in the incident and called it a false flag attack. A number of investigations have discovered evidence that the explosions and evacuations at Donetsk were staged by Russia. The same day, Vladimir Putin delivered a speech denouncing the right to statehood of Ukraine and recognizing Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic as independent states. Following the speech, Putin ordered additional forces into the Donbas region, calling it a peacekeeping mission. As Russian forces continued to cross the border into the Donetsk region into February 22nd, the United States declared an invasion, and the same day, the Russian Federal Council unanimously authorized Vladimir Putin to mobilize military forces outside of Russia. Ukraine declared a state of emergency. While the West had declared an invasion 2 days prior, on February 24th, Putin announced a special military operation in the Donbas region, shortly followed by reports of explosions in cities all across Ukraine. Despite the claim that the special military operation was to be in Donbas, Russian forces quickly swept across the border and deep into Ukraine. NATO was placed on high alert for fear that Ukraine would fall within days as the legions of Russian armor swept across the Ukrainian countryside to Kyiv and then beyond. The following days were pure chaos. Russian paratroopers flooded the areas around strategic points and around Kyiv itself, and much of the Ukrainian Air Force was knocked out of the sky despite propaganda stories to the contrary, like the infamous Ghost of Kyiv. Russian shells landed with the Zaporizhia nuclear power station, causing a fire. The Russians claimed to have agreed to a ceasefire around the city of Mariupol, but continued to bomb the city anyway. On March 5th, the Russians captured the village of Bucha, where months later it was discovered to have become a nightmarish mass grave with the signs of mass killings and war crimes committed on a large scale. Russian and Ukrainian forces battled fiercely for the city of Hostomel, home of the Hostomel airport, which the Russians wanted to capture to use as a landing zone for troops and supplies. The city and airport changed hands a number of times during the fighting. On March 6th, more plans to let civilians evacuate the city of Mariupol failed to materialize as the Russians continued to assault the city outskirts and heavily bomb its interior, with the city's mayor being abducted by the Russian forces on March 11th. Hostomel likewise announced that their city mayor had been murdered by the Russian forces. Russia announced the opening of 6 humanitarian corridors, but the announcement drew heavy international criticism, as all but 2 of the corridors were designed to funnel refugees into Russia itself. Only days after the beginning of the war, Russia's offensive was beginning to slow down, as poor training had resulted in a large fighting force being unable to support itself. Russian armored vehicles pushed ahead of infantry support, leaving themselves open to ambushes. Vehicles all across the front began running out of fuel as they had left behind their logistics train. Exposed tanks fell victim in large numbers to American-supplied Javelin anti-tank missiles. The Ukrainian Air Force continued against all odds to fly missions, demoralizing and terrifying Russian troops on the ground. Russian troops ran out of food and began looting local villages. And to make things worse, a deep freeze settled over eastern Ukraine, freezing countless Russians who'd run out of fuel to death. To make matters worse for the Russian military, they had lost a number of generals in combat by this point, with many more dying in the months to come. As the fighting intensified and the losses mounted, Russia announced that it would be recruiting 16,000 fighters from overseas, with Wagner Group having already recruited 4,000 Syrians. On March 16th, the regional drama theater in Mariupol, which had been housing over 1,000 people and marked with the word "children" in Russian in large painted letters on multiple locations all over its roof, was bombed by the Russian Air Force, killing many of those hiding inside. 3 days later, the Russian Air Force bombed a school in Mariupol housing over 400. In the midst of the chaos, Russia opened a new front, pushing at Ukraine through the Chernobyl exclusion zone, where they destroyed a lab built in 2015 designed to house highly radioactive materials. As fighting within the zone picked up, long settled dust was thrown up into the atmosphere, leading to an elevated level of radiation in the region. Not enough to worry about, but enough to remind the world just how dangerous this conflict was quickly becoming. By late March, Ukraine began to stage successful counterattacks, claiming a number of areas previously occupied by the Russians. A number of talks between Ukraine and Russia had taken place to attempt to find some sort of a negotiated agreement on the war, with all efforts ending in failure. On March 29th, Russian forces abandoned attempts to take Kyiv and northern Ukraine entirely and began redeploying troops to eastern Ukraine and the embattled Donbass region, even abandoning control of the nuclear power station in Chernobyl. On the 1st of April, 2 Mi-24 attack helicopters, presumably belonging to the Ukrainian military, penetrated the Russian border and attacked a Russian military fuel depot behind the lines in Belgorod. 3 days later, the massacre in Bucha was discovered by Ukrainian forces as they retook the village. A day after that, President Zelensky accused Russia of committing genocide against the Ukrainian people and addressed the United Nations Security Council. Images of the horrors committed by the Russian military in Bucha, as well as images of other war crimes, seemingly motivated a number of leaders within the West to begin bolder support of Ukraine, sending more expensive and more advanced weapons to the embattled nation. These weapons, along with the flood of foreign volunteers coming to Ukraine, took immense pressure off of the nation, allowing for bolder and more effective offenses in the future, such as the sinking of the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the Moskva, on April 14th, a blow that would result in all future naval operations of the Russian Federation being conducted further off the coast, rendering them less effective overall.
World in Context will be right back after this quick ad break. Welcome back.
In the month following the sinking of the Moskva, President Biden signed the Lend-Lease Act, allowing the United States to substantially increase the amount of military equipment, ammunition, and other items to be supplied to Ukraine. The Lend-Lease Act had only ever been enacted once before, during World War II, to provide aid to Great Britain and the Soviet Union as the two nations found themselves being attacked by Nazi Germany. The United States was not alone, as many other countries within NATO began sending weapons and aid to Ukraine as well. As the war raged, and as Ukraine began to turn the tables in some areas, Mariupol was not so lucky. The defenders had not surrendered to the Russian invaders after weeks of constant attack and besiegement, with the Russian military rendering much of the city and countless souls within to rubble in that time. As more and more of the city fell, the Ukrainian defenders retreated at Sevastopol steel plant in the center of the city and continued to fight on, even as they became cut off from food and water, holding out until May 17th, when finally the last survivors surrendered to the occupiers. Over the next few months, Ukraine managed to hold on to the Donbas region, while Ukrainian commanders planned a daring counteroffensive for September. This counteroffensive was based upon a concept of warfare used by the United States to great effect in Desert Storm known as the Thunder Run. Now, to grossly oversimplify, a Thunder Run is a concept where you essentially take the quickest and most combat-effective units you have, you concentrate them into a small point, and you hit the enemy front line as fast as you can, creating a hole which you breach through the toughest points and get behind them where you can destroy them much easier and take less casualties. Now, it's a risky play because if you aren't quick, you can quickly become encircled. Ukraine employed the Thunder Run to great success during the offensive of Kharkiv, where they hit position after position with such speed that oftentimes Russian rear positions were destroyed before they even realized that the frontline positions ahead of them had been destroyed as well. This offensive resulted in a large amount of territory being lost from the Russians and morale soaring for the Ukrainian forces. As Russia's casualties piled up into the high tens of thousands, Vladimir Putin announced partial mobilization of Russia's population on September 21st, deepening the pool of conscripts that could be called upon, this also being the first mobilization since the Second World War. On October 8th, a day after Vladimir Putin's 70th birthday, Ukrainian special forces destroyed one of the two suspension bridges connecting Crimea to mainland Russia. Likely as retaliation, the following day, Russia launched a number of cruise missiles and Iranian-made drones into Ukraine, targeting the civilian power grid. Now, this attack was largely successful as it rendered a large swath of Ukraine completely without power, and at a terrible time as winter was slowly beginning to creep towards the country. Despite this, a month later, the Ukrainian military liberated the city of Kherson after an 8-month Russian occupation of the city. Following this in December, President Zelensky left Ukraine for the first time since the beginning of the war to address the United States Congress and meet with President Biden. During the visit, President Biden announced that he would be sending an additional $2.2 billion of weapons and aid to the country, including advanced Patriot defense systems. Following the liberation of Kherson, progress slowed and both sides of the front line stalled, reducing the scene into something not seen since the First World War. Trench warfare to the sound of artillery day and night at a scale that rendered the countryside barren, only broken up by the occasional charges into each other's trenches to be followed by brutal and bloody close-quarter combat. This remains the state of the war in most locations at time of recording, with very few updates coming since then, at least until January 25th of the following year, 2023, when Germany, after spending months of barring other European nations from sending advanced main battle tanks to Ukraine, finally relented, taking the UK's lead of sending Challenger 2s, announcing that Germany themselves would also be sending modern Leopard 2s to the embattled country. At the same time, the United States announced that they too would be sending 31 state-of-the-art M1A2 Abrams main battle tanks. While on the other side, Russia continues to train more and more new recruits with the eventual goal of victory through drowning Ukraine through sheer mass of human bodies, as they once did against the Nazis in the same region of the world. Also, at time of recording, the newest development of this ever-expanding conflict is the Russian announcement that they will be deploying tactical nuclear weapons just north of Ukraine in Belarus. Though we assure you these weapons are not meant for Ukraine, they're meant to do two things. One, to send a message to NATO to stay out. This is not NATO's business, don't even think of getting involved. And two, to send a message to Belarus that Russia remains a strong ally. I've stated before that it is my opinion that part of Putin's reasoning for the timing of this war is to split a wedge in NATO by placing countries overly dependent upon Russian oil into a tight spot. Countries such as Germany, who to Putin's credit did seem quite reluctant to stand up to this new Russian aggression for some time, though it seems even Germany seems to have come and found their courage in recent months. I've also stated that I believe that the American withdrawal from Afghanistan was at least in part of Putin's decision-making to pull the trigger when he did. While it's obvious by looking at the timeline Russia was planning on this invasion for some time, I do have to wonder if Putin was blinded by the idea of a scared NATO and he may have moved plans up before every piece was in place to attempt to capitalize upon what he thought was an opportunity to make NATO members question how strong America really was. The irony is, if this is Putin's thinking, it backfired catastrophically. If there are any doubts about the United States within NATO, the outstanding performance of the American-made Javelin missiles against the top-of-the-line Russian tanks only served to make Russia look weak, not the United States. NATO, at the same time, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, has had an unclear future at times and has been largely without a purpose. But Putin reminded NATO exactly what that purpose is, and ironically, his sudden invasion of a non-NATO nation has finally convinced two long-time non-NATO countries to take the plunge and join, Sweden and Finland, two military powerhouses in their own right who only serve to strengthen the alliance even more. So where does all of this leave us? We've talked about Putin's rise to power and Russia's fears of being invaded from the West, the gateways of access to Russia, their wars against former Soviet states and ever-increasing influence. And now we've talked about the largest war in Europe since 1945. Where to next? This is a question I've been asking myself repeatedly since this all started, over and over and over, trying to look at all of the things on the ground, how things have changed, looking at the past, the inner workings within Russia and the rest of the world. A question of where do we go next? And while we can never be sure of where history will take us, we can at least take what we've discussed to outline a few scenarios, at the very least to see how wrong we are when none of them come to pass. First, the war itself. How does it end? Let's look at a Ukrainian victory first. Funny enough, the first thing that pops into my mind with the Ukrainian victory isn't about Ukraine, but it's about what might happen within Russia. I can see the end result of Russia fully failing Ukraine being a complete denial. The hyper-nationalist Russian population at large would not accept being bested by a smaller country, regardless of how many modern weapons have been pumped into it during a war. They would need someone to blame, and the most likely candidate would be none other than Vladimir Putin himself, the man who spent decades shoring up his own power to try and insulate himself from being torn down by his own people. Now, how this would play out depends on a few different factors. First, how much the military upper brass still supports him. Second, how much of the civilian population support him. These factors will make the difference between civil war and assassination, or Putin simply fleeing and hiding away in China. Make no mistake, by the way, if the military turned on Putin, I find it very unlikely that he would live to see trial. Why would he? He's created a system that's used to assassinating anyone who gets in the way. But if he does retain power, oh boy, it's not going to be good for anyone who tries to rise up against him. But the entire military might not be with him at that point. Some of them may actually end up on the side of the civilians. It's hard to say. But enough about Putin. Regardless what happens to him, or if there's a change at the top at all, a depleted Russian military almost means one thing for sure: secessionist movements across the Russian Federation, old wounds from the Chechen wars, generation-old grudges in Siberia. It doesn't really matter what the reasons would be. As with the collapse of the USSR in the early 90s, I have difficulty seeing something the size of Russia filled with so many different people, so many unhappy people, sticking together without the threat of overwhelming violence from Moscow. And on top of that, you have changing politics within Russia even before this war, as demographics change and as power structures change. A good example of this is Siberia, who are finding an enormous amount of resources right under their feet as the permafrost begins to thaw. The end result of this is that they may become very wealthy someday and find themselves no longer dependent on Moscow for the resources they don't have to survive, as they may be rich enough just to trade with other countries for that what they don't have. So again, regardless of the specifics, if Russia loses the war, I think that it's at least a decent probability that you might see secessionist movements or a total civil war. And civil war means bloodshed, but we'll get into that in a bit.
World in Context will be right back after this quick ad break. Welcome back.
But what about Ukraine? We're talking about Ukrainian victory, and all we've done is talk about Russia. Well, Ukraine is interesting. I really don't see them simply being content with kicking Russia out of their borders. After Russia went back into Chechnya after they weren't finished the first time, after Russia went back into Ukraine after they weren't finished in 2014, who's to say that Russia wouldn't simply lick their wounds and try again sometime in the future? From the Ukrainian perspective, I could see the concern of this. And again, believing the only solution may be to defang the snake, it makes perfect sense. A large amount of Russia's industry, including that which is used to support the Russian military and design their equipment, build their equipment, only lies a couple hundred kilometers from Ukraine's east border. And I could see Ukraine launching their own special military operation in the future to destroy that infrastructure, if not annex that territory themselves. And considering the amount of high-end military equipment that Ukraine is likely to be sitting pretty on by the end of all this, I don't really see what would be able to stop them. So that's a Ukrainian victory. But what about a Russian victory? What does that look like? I know right now that seems pretty far-fetched, but I assure you it's not as unrealistic as it sounds. During the Cold War, NATO forces estimated that they would have to kill 3 Soviet troops for every one of their own they lost to make up for the manpower difference. This is why NATO militaries today are so well trained and equipped compared to countries like, well, Russia. It's leftover doctrine from those dark days, where the West feared T-72s and BMPs pouring out of the Fulda Gap into West Germany and swallowing all of Europe. Well, at this very moment, Ukraine may have more manpower deployed. Russia still has yet to declare full mobilization of the population. And while Russia is having trouble making tanks right now, without the fancy Western computer parts, that won't stop them forever. Eventually, they will find ways around this problem. Perhaps a return to pre-Russian Federation thinking, less advanced tanks, but more of them. And this is to say nothing of the still vast stockpile of old Soviet armor Russia is sitting on. If Russia truly declared full mobilization, you could see enough troops to overwhelm the Ukrainians in a matter of months. Would they be well trained? No. Would they die in far greater numbers than the Ukrainians? Yes. Still may not matter. There would be so many. Remember the figure I mentioned before, that NATO forces would have to kill 3 Soviet troops for every one of their own losses. Ukraine would very quickly be looking at 7 to 1 or higher, considering Ukraine themselves have already lost men in this war too, a lot of them. So again, what does a Russian victory look like? Well, let's start with a question. Do you really think this would stop in Ukraine? A lot depends on that question. I think it's at least possible that almost immediately you'd see the breakaway region, Transnistria from Moldova, fall under a new Moscow-led alliance against the West, joined by Belarus, the newly puppeted Ukraine, probably Syria as well. This would begin to look like the formation of a new Warsaw Pact, and pretty quickly. Not saying this would be smooth sailing, as I doubt that Ukraine would go down quietly. Russia would end up having to contend with insurgency for many years. And as this new bloc continued to grow, it would become more and more isolated from the Western world and more connected to China and Iran, likely eventually making power plays into the Pacific and South America, Africa, and even the Persian Gulf, as these kinds of great power competitions begin to emerge once again. Depending what state Russia's military may be in at the end of a war with Ukraine, an invasion of Moldova may not be off the table right immediately after Ukraine. Remember, Russia wants to lock down what it sees as the main pathways for invasion at all costs, and non-NATO Moldova sits right on top of one set pathway. Georgia would likely follow soon other, being on another, leaving only Poland as the remaining gateway for invading forces to come through. Russia's fear with NATO has always been that through NATO expansionism, eventually NATO would end up upon Russia's border. Well, if Russia takes Ukraine, the NATO border will be against Russia, but not through any fault of NATO's. Ironically, it will be because of a result of Russian expansionism, though I find it unlikely that that would stop Russia from complaining about it. And as time would go on, I could see Russia launching another long game style undermining campaign to try and erode the connection between Eastern Poland from that of the Polish government, encouraging the creation of yet another pro-Russian breakaway state that needs Russian protection. And if Russia truly sees Eastern Poland as a matter of life and death for the existence of the Russian state, They might not wait that long. Outlandish as it may sound, I don't necessarily think that tactical nuclear weapons would be out of the question. While unlikely, I could see Russia seriously going for a if I can't have it, then nobody will style approach. However, let's take it down a notch from nuclear warfare. I mentioned that there were a couple scenarios if Russia won. Let's take a look at the other one. If Russia wins, it is likely going to come at great cost of lives and military equipment. Like before, there are bound to be parts of Russia who feel that this is the best time to try and break off. And like before, it would get ugly. But how ugly, you ask? Well, a civil war on the scale we're talking about would rapidly become a humanitarian crisis, with at least tens of thousands fleeing their homes. Order throughout Russia and Central Europe would break down as Belarus and other puppet states Russia controls would suddenly be left adrift. Arms and people smuggling into Western Europe would become a major problem, and sectarian violence would likely break out in multiple locations, as the system that once kept diverse groups across the world's largest country from killing each other would evaporate, leaving only a vacuum. You may see a United Nations and NATO response similar to the peacekeeping mission established during the Bosnian War, only on a much, much larger scale. The great irony is that if Russia's civil war is a likely outcome regardless of who wins, NATO would end up involved in the aftermath after all, just in a very different mission than what they expected. Or, in the end, perhaps I'm wrong on all accounts. And none of this happens. Pretty likely, honestly. I certainly don't claim that any things are going to happen, though I do find trying to figure out what might be coming out of the fog ahead, based on what the waters we passed through were like before, to be an interesting endeavor. But enough about what-ifs. Next week, we return to the history of ongoing events around the globe and try to understand how they came to be. But until then, I've been Ryan Osborne, and this is World in Context. Thanks for listening.